It happened without warning, no statement, no delay, no explanation. Just hours before stepping into the public eye, Prince William abruptly canceled a highly anticipated joint appearance. Palace aides scrambled, phones went silent, and behind the gilded walls, a single phrase began circulating in hushed tones. The documents have surfaced. What forced the future king to retreat so suddenly, and what, exactly, had been uncovered? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The event had been carefully arranged, the kind of appearance that signals unity, stability, and quiet confidence within the monarchy. Senior figures were expected. The timing was deliberate. And yet, in a matter of moments, everything unraveled. Invitations became irrelevant. Security details shifted without explanation. Even seasoned royal correspondents, those accustomed to last-minute changes, began to sense that this was not routine. This was different. This was abrupt in a way that felt almost defensive. Reports suggest that the decision came from William himself, not through layers of palace bureaucracy, but directly swift, decisive, and without room for negotiation. That alone raised questions. Because William is not known for impulsive moves. He calculates, he prepares, he endures. But this time, something had clearly disrupted that control. Palace communications, usually precise and immediate, became strangely delayed. Statements were drafted, then withheld. Briefings that should have clarified the situation instead deepened the mystery. Insiders whisper that even within the inner circle, information was being tightly restricted. Conversations were cut short. Staff were reminded firmly of confidentiality. And in those quiet corridors, where tradition usually dictates calm, there was tension. Not loud, not chaotic, but heavy, unspoken. The kind that settles in when everyone knows something significant has happened, but no one dares to say it aloud. Then came the first real fracture in the silence. Media insiders, those with long-standing connections to palace operations, began hinting that the cancellation wasn't about scheduling, nor health, nor even protocol. It was about exposure. According to various interpretations circulating among royal journalists, a set of documents sensitive, possibly historic, had surfaced unexpectedly. Their origins remained unclear. Their contents, even more so. But the reaction they triggered was unmistakable. Because if there is one thing the monarchy has mastered over centuries, it is control. Control of narrative. Control of timing. Control of truth. And yet, in this moment, that control appeared to slip, if only briefly. What made it more unsettling was the speed. The shift from routine engagement to total withdrawal didn't unfold over days. It happened in hours. As if someone somewhere had seen something that couldn't be ignored. Something that demanded immediate silence. Immediate distance. Immediate recalibration. And at the center of it all stood William, not addressing the public, not offering reassurance, but stepping back entirely. A move that spoke louder than any statement ever could. Because when a future king chooses silence over visibility, it is never without reason. And as the whispers grew louder, as speculation began to take shape, one truth became impossible to ignore: the cancellation was not the story. It was the signal. The first visible crack in something far deeper, far more consequential, now threatening to surface. But the cancellation was only the surface. What lay inside those leaked documents would send shockwaves through the very core of the monarchy. They weren't meant for public eyes, sealed, archived, and buried within layers of royal protocol. Yet somehow, a collection of sensitive documents had emerged, circulating quietly among journalists and insiders. Their contents? Described by those who've glimpsed them as deeply destabilizing. What secrets did they contain, and why now? What made the situation even more unsettling was not just the existence of these documents, but their nature. Reports suggest they were not simple correspondence or outdated records, but something far more significant: documents tied to internal royal decisions, possibly spanning years, even decades, legal frameworks, financial arrangements, historical understandings that were never meant to leave the confines of palace archives. Those familiar with royal administration whisper that such materials are typically locked behind multiple layers of protection, accessible only to a select few. And yet, here they were, moving quietly through the hands of individuals who understood exactly what they were looking at, and more importantly, what it meant. Different interpretations of the leak describe a collection rather than a single file. Not one mistake, but a pattern. Not one revelation, but several threads, all pointing towards something larger, something systemic. That is what made insiders uneasy. Because isolated incidents can be managed. They can be explained. But a collection of documents, each reinforcing the other, begins to form a narrative, and narratives, once formed, are far harder to contain. The question of origin quickly became unavoidable. How does something so tightly guarded find its way out? Some suggest an internal breach, a calculated move by someone within the institution who understood both the value and the risk. Others lean toward the possibility of an external compromise, an unseen hand exploiting vulnerabilities that were never supposed to exist. But insiders familiar with the palace's rigid structures find that difficult to accept, because for something like this to surface, it would require not just access, but knowledge, context, intent. And that raises a far more uncomfortable possibility that this was not an accident but a decision. Meanwhile, within media circles, the response was cautious, almost restrained. Veteran royal correspondents, figures known for their discretion, began acknowledging the documents without fully revealing them. It was a careful dance confirming authenticity without crossing lines that could trigger legal consequences. Some referenced the material in vague terms, others hinted at its implications through carefully chosen language. But the message was consistent. This was real. And it mattered. Behind the scenes, the palace moved swiftly. Legal teams were reportedly mobilized almost immediately, not just to assess the damage, but to contain it. Strategies were discussed. Responses were drafted, revised, and in some cases, abandoned altogether. Because the challenge was not simply denying the existence of the documents, it was navigating what they represented. If addressed too directly, they risked validating the very narrative the palace sought to avoid. If ignored, they risked allowing speculation to spiral unchecked. And somewhere within this tightening circle of secrecy and pressure stood Prince William, not as a distant observer, but as someone deeply, personally affected by what was unfolding. Because according to those closest to the situation, it wasn't just the leak that mattered. It was what the documents revealed and how directly they intersected with his role, his responsibilities, and his future. As scrutiny intensified, attention quickly turned to the one figure whose reaction revealed just how serious the situation had become: Prince William himself. Those closest to him say they've never seen him like this, controlled, composed, yet unmistakably shaken. Prince William, long regarded as the steady hand of the monarchy, was suddenly forced into silence. His decision to withdraw wasn't strategic, it was necessary. Something in those documents struck at the very heart of his role, his family, and his future. For years, William has carried a reputation built on discipline and restraint. He is the figure who does not react impulsively, the one who absorbs pressure rather than reflects it. While others within the royal sphere have been drawn into public turbulence, he has remained measured, deliberate, almost immovable in his sense of duty. That is what made this moment so jarring. Because those familiar with his inner circle suggest that behind closed doors, the composure did not hold in the same way. It didn't collapse, but it shifted. Subtle changes. Shortened conversations. A silence that lingered longer than usual. The kind of silence that signals not confusion but calculation under strain. Insiders whisper that the documents didn't just present a challenge, they presented a confrontation. Not with the public, not even with the press, but with something far more personal. Different interpretations suggest that within those pages were implications tied directly to decisions, alignments, or understandings that William himself had inherited rather than created. And that distinction matters, because it reframes the situation entirely. This was no longer about managing perception, it was about confronting legacy. His decision to cancel the appearance, then, begins to take on a different meaning. It wasn't simply about avoiding scrutiny. It was about creating space to understand, to assess, and perhaps most importantly, to decide. Because every move William makes is not just personal, it is institutional. It reflects not only on him, but on the monarchy he is destined to lead. And in this moment, the weight of that future seemed to press in more heavily than ever before. Alongside him, Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained a quiet but constant presence. Those who have observed her role over the years understand that her strength is not loud, not performative, but deeply stabilizing. Reports suggest she was there during key discussions, not as a passive observer, but as someone fully aware of the gravity of what was unfolding. Her reactions, though not publicly visible, were described by some insiders as measured yet deeply concerned. Because whatever the documents contained, it wasn't just a challenge for William, it was a challenge for their shared future, their family, and the role they are preparing to inherit together. And that is where the situation begins to deepen. Because the stakes hinted within those documents were not abstract. They were personal. They touched on identity, responsibility, and the delicate balance between tradition and truth. For William, this was not just another test of leadership, it was a moment of reckoning. A point where duty and reality no longer moved in quiet alignment, but collided in a way that demanded response. Yet even as he processed the implications, even as decisions began forming behind the scenes, one thing became increasingly clear to those watching closely: this was no longer contained within the boundaries of one man's reaction. The ripple effect was already spreading, moving beyond William, beyond his immediate circle, and into the broader structure of the monarchy itself. But this wasn't just about William, it was about what the documents revealed about the monarchy itself. Beneath the modern monarchy lies a fragile architecture of legacy, centuries of decisions, alliances, and carefully guarded truths. According to those familiar with the leaked material, this wasn't just scandal, it was exposure, a revelation tied not to the present, but to a legacy long thought untouchable. Because what began as whispers about documents quickly evolved into something far more unsettling, a realization that these papers did not exist in isolation. Reports suggest they were connected to a chain of decisions stretching back years, perhaps even generations, embedded within the quiet machinery that sustains the monarchy. Financial arrangements that were never publicly explained. Agreements that were understood internally, but never acknowledged beyond palace walls. And most critically, interpretations of authority: who holds it, who inherits it, and under what conditions it can be exercised. These are not small matters. They are the foundation upon which the institution stands. Those familiar with royal structures often describe the monarchy not as a single entity, but as a layered system, part tradition, part legal framework, part unwritten understanding passed from one generation to the next. And it is within that unwritten space, insiders suggest, that the true significance of these documents may lie. Because if even a fraction of what is being whispered is accurate, then what has surfaced is not merely information, but contradiction. A divergence between what has been presented and what has been practiced. And that is where the danger begins. The idea of a buried legacy resurfacing is not new to the monarchy. History is filled with moments where past decisions return, reshaping the present in ways no one anticipated. But what makes this moment different, according to various interpretations, is the timing. The monarchy today operates under intense public scrutiny, balancing centuries-old tradition with modern expectations of transparency. In that environment, the reemergence of unresolved or undisclosed matters carries a different weight. It is no longer just about internal reconciliation, it is about external perception, trust, stability, continuity. Comparisons have already begun to surface in quiet conversations among royal commentators. Not direct parallels, but echoes, moments in history where hidden truths disrupted carefully maintained narratives. And while each situation is unique, the underlying pattern remains the same. Once a narrative begins to fracture, it becomes increasingly difficult to restore it to its original form, because the question is no longer whether something happened, but what else might still remain hidden. That is the unspoken tension now surrounding these documents. Not just what they reveal, but what they imply, because implications are harder to contain than facts. They invite interpretation. They create uncertainty. And uncertainty, within an institution built on continuity, is deeply destabilizing. Palace insiders are said to be acutely aware of this, which explains the measured, almost cautious response unfolding behind the scenes. This is not panic, it is calculation. A recognition that every move made now will shape not just the immediate outcome, but the long-term narrative of the monarchy itself. And at the center of this unfolding realization stands Prince William, not just as an individual reacting to a crisis, but as a figure positioned between past and future. Because whatever these documents ultimately represent, they do not belong solely to history. They extend forward, into the structure he is expected to lead, into the version of the monarchy he will one day define, which is why the stakes feel so much higher than a typical controversy. This is not about reputation alone. It is about continuity. About whether the carefully constructed bridge between past and present can withstand the pressure now being placed upon it. And as that pressure builds, as questions multiply and answers remain just out of reach, the atmosphere within palace walls begins to shift, not visibly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Because when history begins to resurface in this way, it does not do so quietly. It demands attention. It demands response. And most of all, it demands resolution whether the institution is ready for it or not. And as the weight of history pressed in, a quiet battle began to unfold within palace walls. No denials, no confirmations. Just silence, calculated, deliberate, and deafening. The palace, known for its carefully measured responses, chose not to engage. But insiders suggest this wasn't avoidance, it was containment. Behind the scenes, a coordinated effort was underway to manage what could not be undone. Because in moments like this, silence is never empty. It is active, intentional, and often more revealing than any statement could ever be. Reports suggest that within hours of the document's surfacing, internal channels shifted into a different mode, entirely less about routine operations, more about strategic defense. Communications teams, usually tasked with shaping narratives, were instead instructed to hold back. No clarifications, no soft denials. Nothing that could anchor the story in a way that might validate its existence. It was a risky move, but one that hinted at the complexity of what they were dealing with. Because sometimes, addressing a situation directly gives it structure, and structure gives it permanence. Legal teams, according to those familiar with palace procedures, were among the first to mobilize. Their role wasn't just to assess the documents themselves, but to assess the documents that contained the information, but to anticipate the ripple effect, how the information might spread, how it might be interpreted, and most critically, how it might be challenged. This wasn't simply about protecting reputation. It was about protecting the framework of the institution. Every word, every clause, every historical reference within those documents had to be understood not in isolation, but as part of a much larger system. And if that system was now being questioned, even indirectly, the response had to be precise, controlled, surgical. At the same time, efforts to trace the origin of the leak intensified, because understanding where it came from could determine how it was handled. Insiders whisper that multiple scenarios were being considered, each carrying its own implications. An internal source would suggest fracture, perhaps even intent. An external breach would point to vulnerability, a gap in the very safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of exposure. Neither possibility was comfortable, and neither could be addressed publicly without risking further escalation. So the investigation remained internal, quiet, and deeply focused. Meanwhile, discussions around damage control began to take shape, not in the dramatic sense often portrayed, but in the measured, almost methodical way the monarchy has historically responded to crisis. Different interpretations suggest that these discussions were not about immediate solutions, but about long-term positioning. How to absorb the impact without allowing it to redefine the institution. How to respond without appearing reactive. How to maintain continuity in a moment that threatened to disrupt it. These are not simple questions. And the answers, when they come, are rarely immediate. Outside those walls, however, the pressure was building. Media outlets, already aware of the situation, began to push harder. Not recklessly, but persistently. Carefully worded inquiries. Requests for confirmation that were expected to be declined. And yet, each unanswered question added weight to the story. Because silence, while strategic, creates space, and that space is quickly filled with speculation. Some grounded, some not. But all contributing to a growing sense that something significant was being withheld. And at the center of this tightening narrative stood Prince William, navigating not just the internal response, but the external perception of it. Because every moment of silence, every withheld statement, inevitably reflected back on him not as the architect of the situation, but as the figure most closely associated with its future implications. Yet the longer the silence stretched, the louder the questions became, and the harder they were to contain. Within hours, speculation exploded, headlines without answers, experts without confirmation, and a public desperate to understand. From London to New York, the story took on a life of its own. But beneath the noise, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed to something far more serious than a routine royal controversy. At first, it was fragmented. A cancelled appearance here, a quiet acknowledgement there, but then the pieces began to connect. Major outlets started circling the same unanswered questions, each one approaching from a different angle, yet arriving at a similar conclusion: this wasn't just a scheduling issue, and it wasn't just a leak. It was something layered, something complex. Reports suggest that journalists who had seen fragments of the documents, or had spoken to those who had, began to shift their tone, less speculative, more cautious, as if they were stepping carefully around something they couldn't fully disclose, but clearly understood. Royal commentators, many of whom have spent decades interpreting palace movements, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Usually, patterns are predictable. Responses follow a certain rhythm. But this time, the silence disrupted that rhythm entirely. Analysts began to speak in broader terms, not about what was known, but about what it could mean. Institutional vulnerability, historical inconsistencies, the possibility that the monarchy was facing not just a moment of scrutiny, but a moment of exposure. And while no one was stating anything outright, the direction of the conversation was unmistakable. Then came the amplification. Social media, always quick to react, began filling in the gaps left by official silence. Theories multiplied, some grounded, drawing on fragments of credible reporting. Others more speculative, driven by the absence of clear information. But together, they created momentum. A sense that something was unfolding in real time, even if the full picture remained just out of reach, and that momentum made containment increasingly difficult. Because once a narrative begins to spread beyond controlled channels, it evolves, it shifts. It becomes something larger than its origin. Amid this growing storm, credible voices, those known for restraint, began to hint at deeper implications. Not confirmations, not revelations, but signals. Subtle shifts in language. Careful emphasis on the seriousness of the situation. References to long-term consequences and institutional sensitivity. These were not casual remarks. They were measured, intentional. And for those paying close attention, they carried weight. Because when the most cautious observers begin to signal concern, it suggests that what lies beneath the surface is significant. Public perception, too, began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Questions that might once have been dismissed as unlikely started to feel plausible. The idea that something within the monarchy could be unsettled, truly unsettled, no longer seemed impossible. And that shift, subtle as it was, mattered. Because the monarchy does not rely solely on structure or tradition. It relies on belief, continuity, the sense that, despite challenges, it remains steady. Now, that steadiness was being tested. At the center of it all remained Prince William, not speaking, not clarifying, but inevitably shaping the narrative through his absence. Because in a moment defined by noise, silence becomes its own form of communication. And the longer that silence held, the more the story expanded beyond its original boundaries, touching on questions that extended far beyond a single event or a single set of documents. And as the world watched, the monarchy faced a defining question: how do you protect an institution when its secrets are no longer contained? Behind closed doors, unity began to fracture. What should have been a coordinated response instead revealed subtle divisions, differences in approach, in priorities, and in loyalty. For some, the priority was preservation. For others, it was control. And caught in the middle was a future king forced to navigate both. Because as the pressure mounted from outside, something equally significant was unfolding within. Reports suggest that senior figures within the royal structure did not see the situation through the same lens. Some believed the silence must hold at all costs, that tradition, restraint, and distance were the only way to prevent further damage. Others, however, interpreted the moment differently. They saw the risk not in exposure, but in hesitation. That failing to act decisively, to shape the narrative before it shaped them, could lead to something far more difficult to contain. And it was within this quiet but unmistakable divide that tension began to build. Different interpretations of internal discussions describe an atmosphere that was not openly confrontational, but undeniably strained. Conversations that once flowed with ease became measured, cautious. Words were chosen carefully. Positions were implied rather than stated outright. Because this was not just a disagreement over strategy, it was a deeper conflict between two ways of thinking. One rooted in centuries of precedent, where silence and time were allies. The other shaped by a modern landscape, where information moves faster than control ever could. At the center of this evolving dynamic stood Prince William, not merely as an observer, but as the one expected to reconcile these opposing forces. His role was no longer passive. It was active, immediate, and deeply consequential. Because whatever decision emerged would not only influence the current situation, but set a precedent for how future crises would be handled. And that realization added weight to every discussion, every pause, every moment of hesitation. Insiders whisper that William approached this not with urgency alone, but with a sense of long-term consequence. He understood that reacting too quickly could validate the situation, but waiting too long could allow it to spiral beyond control. It was a delicate balance, one that required both restraint and clarity. And in navigating that balance, he was not alone. Alongside him, Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained a steady presence, offering not direction, but perspective. Her role, as described by those familiar with her influence, was not to lead the conversation, but to ground it to ensure that decisions were not driven solely by pressure, but by principle. Yet even with that stabilizing force, the strain on internal relationships became increasingly apparent. Long-standing alignments began to shift. Assumptions that had once gone unquestioned were now being reconsidered. And while none of this unfolded in the public eye, its impact was real. Because institutions, no matter how structured, are still shaped by the people within them. And when those people begin to see a situation differently, the institution itself begins to feel that shift. What made this moment particularly significant was not just the presence of disagreement, but the nature of it. This was not about personal conflict. It was about direction. About how the monarchy defines itself in a moment of uncertainty. Whether it leans into tradition or adapts to a changing environment. Whether it protects its past or redefines its future. And for William, standing at the intersection of those choices, the weight of decision became impossible to ignore. Because whatever path he chose would not simply resolve the present, it would shape what comes next. But in the end, the outcome wouldn't be decided behind closed doors, it would be defined by what comes next. This was never just about a cancelled appearance. It was about exposure, accountability, and the fragile balance between tradition and truth. As the dust begins to settle, one thing is clear: the monarchy has entered a new era, one where silence may no longer be enough. Because what unfolded in those tense hours and guarded conversations did more than disrupt a schedule, it shifted a perception. For generations, the monarchy has relied on a quiet understanding with the public. That not everything would be explained, but everything would remain steady. That continuity would outweigh curiosity. But now, that understanding feels less certain. Reports suggest that even within palace circles, there is a growing awareness that the old methods measured silence, controlled distance may no longer carry the same weight they once did. The world has changed. Expectations have shifted. And with them, the space for ambiguity has narrowed. At the center of this transformation stands Prince William, not just as a figure responding to crisis, but as the one who will ultimately define what comes after it. His role, already significant, now carries an added dimension: adaptation. Because the challenge before him is not simply to preserve what exists, but to determine how it evolves. Insiders suggest that this moment, as unsettling as it has been, may also serve as a turning point. A quiet but decisive shift in how the monarchy engages with the world around it, not abandoning tradition, but reinterpreting it in a way that acknowledges the realities of the present. And yet, that path is far from simple, because every step toward transparency raises new questions. How much is shared? How much remains protected? Where is the line between openness and preservation? These are not just strategic decisions, they are philosophical ones. They shape not only how the monarchy is seen, but how it understands itself. And within that tension lies the true complexity of this moment. The need to honor a legacy built on discretion, while navigating a future that demands clarity. the strain of recent events has also revealed something deeper: resilience. Not the quiet, assumed kind, but the tested, deliberate kind. The kind that emerges only when an institution is forced to confront its own vulnerabilities. Because while the documents may have exposed uncertainty, they have also prompted reflection, a reassessment of priorities, a renewed focus on what must endure and what may need to change. And in that process, the monarchy is not just reacting, it is recalibrating. Alongside this recalibration is a growing recognition that legacy is not fixed. It is shaped, refined, and sometimes challenged by the very events that threaten it. For William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, this moment is not just about managing a situation, it is about stepping into a role that demands both strength and flexibility. A role where decisions are no longer guided solely by precedent, but by judgment. By an understanding that the future of the monarchy will not be secured by resisting change, but by navigating it with intention. And so, as the immediate tension begins to ease, what remains is something more enduring: a question, still unresolved, still evolving. Not about what happened, but about what it means. About how an institution rooted in history responds when that history begins to surface in unexpected ways. About whether continuity can coexist with transparency. And about how a future king chooses to lead in a moment where the past and present no longer sit comfortably side by side. Because in the end, it's not the secrets that define a crown, but how it survives when those secrets are revealed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.